Hi everyone, my name is 𝗨𝗃𝗶𝗹 from Agora Studio, and today we're going to look through the ACOM Beta Intro project. A little bit of a history. Agora Community, or ACOM, is a website that we started to share high-end rigs and free education for the animation community. We created some characters for animation that would cover a lot of the archetypes. We called them alpha, beta, delta, gamma, and omega. We also thought it would be fun to create a short 1-minute intro for each of them. The basic idea is that their compound is attacked by robots, and we could show the same event from each character's perspective and how they dealt with those challenges. When we started developing our beta short, we decided to do everything in real time in Unreal Engine. We rigged and animated all the characters, and then all the lighting, VFX, and final output is coming directly from Unreal. In this video, I'm going to give you a high-level view of the structure of the project, so you know where to find the assets that we're sharing. We're also going to take a look at some of those assets directly, and I'll give you a general overview of how we set up the edit and plugged everything into it. Let's get started. Let's start with the overall structure. Under Assets, we'll have the Characters folder. This includes all our character static meshes, animation rigs, any related materials, and some animation libraries that we preserved. Next, we'll have our Locations folder. This is where we stored all of the models that we used to create the set, including any related materials. Moving down to the Props folder, here we'll have all the props we use in the short. Some of them will be static meshes, but some of them will also have animatable control rigs. Next, we have Rig Common. This is where the modules that we use to create our rigs are stored. They're all annotated, and all the dependencies are there as well. Below that, we'll have the VFX folder. This will include all of the assets we're providing that we use in the short, including their BPs or their Niagara systems. Next, we also have the Blueprints utility folder. There's not much in the anim utilities. We kept our anim locator that we use for some shots. You might find that useful, but this is where you'll find the camera rig and some other materials that are related to the setups we used, including the Light Manager BP that we used for lighting. Under that, we'll have the Episodes folder. We structured it like this because we plan to create several of the shorts in Unreal, and so for our organization, we kept it under Episodes, but for you, it'll just be the Intro to Beta and the Welcome Idols. Here you'll find our main edit and all our shot work and animations. The last noteworthy folder is our Movies one. This is where we kept all of our 2D sequences that we used for the visual effects and for the intro and outro cards. I'm going to take a little bit of time here to dive into the main edit and how we set everything up. You could decide to open up the master level first and then the main edit, or the edit alone. Depends on what you want to load. With the main edit open, you can see how simple it is. We have 2 tracks where we staggered our shot sequences and a master audio track. You can click on the camera button here and it'll switch your viewport to the main edit's camera. You can press play and it'll attempt to play real time, but do keep in mind that depending on your setup, you might have to play with some of the optimization options. You can click on this button here to open up the sequence navigation. This was a really helpful tool to see all of the shots in and outs, all the assets that were in there. And as sequences and edits got more complicated, this was a really good way to navigate and find the tracks that you were looking for. There's even a search bar on top. If you want to know how to render the short, you can click on this icon here to open up the movie render queue. From here, you can click on this button to give you 2 of the options that we've provided, Beta Edit or Beta Shots. Edit will create a sequence that runs from 1 to the end of the entire short as one continuous file, and Shots will split up the naming so that you have multiple shots. This really depends on the needs you have. If you click here, you'll open up the MRG. This is the graph for the movie rendering. This has a lot of really cool options. You can set your custom CVARs. You can decide on render layers if you ever do that kind of prod. You can decide what kind of image sequence and output that you're using for the render. Keep in mind that we set our project settings to 24 FPS because we knew we were animating that, and that's reflected here in the edit. But you want to double check that that's the same also here in the output settings. Let's take a look at one of our shot sequences in more detail. Here we'll click on 55 and you'll see that they're all pretty much laid out in a similar way, but there might be a couple of differences depending on if we had 2D effects with a media track or we overrode the post-process sometimes because we wanted to tweak the motion blur or the depth of field. But in general, you'll always start with the camera cuts track. This will activate your camera and, of course, deal with the cuts. We also had a set anim. This was because during the progress of the battle, there was damage to glass, there was damage to backgrounds and decals showing up, and our level artists worked in parallel with animation to populate that. Below that, you'll notice the two animation tracks. One is for our live control rigs, and one is for our baked animations. The main reason we did this was for speed. We wanted to leverage Unreal's real-time capabilities as much as we could. It really helped us get our animations out as quickly as possible. Even though control rigs are still pretty quick, it's noticeably faster when it's baked down to the scale mesh. This was really apparent in shots where we had many characters in them. Last thing to mention is how we worked with the camera. You'll notice that in the anim workspace, there's no camera accessible. We'd step up one level, tweak the camera, and then step back in, and the changes would be reflected in our camera cuts track. This might seem a little cumbersome, but we found it pretty fluid to step up and down using these buttons or this menu. Below that, you'll see the other departments. They worked in their own siloed sequences to create the lighting and visual effects as needed. The beauty of this kind of setup is that we can all work in parallel to get to the goal as quickly as possible. One final thing to point out is here you'll notice that per shot, this is where all the subsequences will be stored for each department, as well as our own dedicated anim workspace. Here, the animators would iterate on their scenes, and also our export process would rebake out their animations to update the animation sequences. Let's take a look at our rigs. In Assets, Characters, you'll see a folder for each character where you can get the modular rig to start playing with. One note about the rigs. While we aimed to get the same number of features that we had in our Maya rigs, we had a lot of learning to do in Unreal while we were in production. And so even though the processes will continue to evolve and improve, as well as the engine itself, this is still a good starting point. We decided to focus our effort on our two hero rigs, Beta and Robot, but we also included the other rigs we used on the short, including some props and a simple camera rig. Let's start with the Beta rig. Right away, you'll notice we tried to match the style of controls we have on our Maya rigs, as well as a lot of our secondary controls with a multi-constraint system will follow along to give you a smoother experience. There are a few hidden controls here that I'll start to expose, but I'll go section by section. Starting with the head, you're going to notice right away that the hair dynamics, and this applies to all characters, is automatically generated. It's real time. You can still tweak this like we did on the show. You simply want to pick the head controller, and you go down to head dynamic visibility. You just toggle that on. This will expose the controls that you could decide to animate and have the interactions on, or if you want to find the base of each control. And here's where you'll find the options to turn them off, or you have some various dampening settings to play around with. Let's continue on to the facial rig. When you pick the head control, you can go down here to control visibility, and this will expose the facial controls for every character. We tried our best to aim for what we had in our Maya rigs, but as I said, since we were learning, we didn't quite get feature complete on most of the rig, but there's a lot of great options in here. We have tongue, teeth, cheeks, eyes, standard stuff. One thing to point out is if you want to go for blinks, you could decide to use the top and lower lids, but there's also a slider here that will animate that for you. Last thing to talk about on the head is the space switching. You'll notice that if you go to the space switching UI in Unreal, you might see a neck world orient. This was part of our early experimentation that might still be in the rig, so be careful not to touch this. This will probably explode the head. If you want to keep the head stable, you can go down to this attribute here, World Align. Turning this on will give you the behavior that you might expect to keep the head stable and stopping it from tilting over. Moving down to the limbs of the characters, this applies to all limbs. You'll notice a couple of features that we want to point out. If you pick the IK effector, there won't be any dedicated space switching, but this is where we often used the Unreal UI and did things on the fly as we needed to. You'll also notice that if you pick the mid controller, right here, we'll get the IK-FK switching. This is keyable, and it should stay synced with the work as you're moving through your shots. Just do keep in mind, if you want to do a space switch, and you'll noticing that the rig does not follow like it does here, it's because you haven't keyed all the controllers. So you'll want to make sure you key all the FK arms and all the IK arm controllers at the same time when you want to do a switch to make sure that those stay synced up. When we are in FK mode, you'll notice that if you pick the top controller here, which would be rotating the entire arm, we do have a built-in orient for world. This obviously moved because it offset the animation, but this will work too as long as you have your stuff keyed, and this will give you the behavior that you might want. If you don't want that, you can just switch it back to parent, and it'll then follow the chest. Last thing I would talk about is you'll notice here we have some metas to sort of splay the character's fingers. If you don't want this behavior, you can pick the last one at the pinky, and you'll see there's a meta spread attribute that you could turn off. This will just allow you to animate the fingers independently. And of course, these are all translatable as you would expect. Another feature throughout all the limbs are the bendy controls that are active by default. These will allow you to kind of get some pretty wacky shapes if you need them. We ended up not going as far as we wanted to with this in beta. We didn't really have the opportunity, but for yourself, you will be able to play around with that as well. Let's go into some of the finer details now. You'll notice the fingers have a propagate button. This will just allow you to not have to rotate each finger joint one by one, and you can start from the top node and it'll go down the chain. As well, there are some corrective shapes that we managed to put into this, but this is something we'd like to develop more in the future. If you go to the mid control on each limb, mostly for the arms though, we didn't put a lot of work into the legs, you'll see if you can scroll down further, you'll notice there's a lot of these correctives here and the values they're set at to by default. This is a way for us to sort of tweak our initial skinning that came out of Maya. So if you notice here, our fingers have a little bit of a more natural angular shape. But if I go up to the correctives, you can always decide to tone these down. Let me find the index. And you'll see that it's going to start softening that up or sharpening it up. These are automatically generated, but again, you have full control at the end when you're animating. I do want to keep in mind that when you do bake this out, in case you need to, there might be a little process that you might have to do to override some of the correctives that are being assigned by the anim blueprint, but we'll talk about that in a sort of walkthrough video. Another kind of hidden controls that you might want to notice are down here at the base. We have control visibility that'll just toggle all the controls on this particular rig. We have tweaker controls. These are some small, finer ones that show up. We use these to basically tweak some of the shapes while we were animating. We also have some secondary ones that are on by default to give you a little bit of muscle flex, but we ended up also using the bendy sometimes to give some muscle jiggle. So this is some stuff you can explore and just look around with on the rig in case you want to play with it. Let's take a quick look at the robot rig. Because it's modular, it'll have a lot of the same features as beta, but you might notice some of the features don't quite work because it was not an organic rig and we didn't really need those features. So you might notice a couple of channels that aren't as necessary. A couple of differences to point out though. Right away we have the same dynamic system, so there's nothing new there. You'll notice that if you pick the head, you'll still get the world align. That'll be the same. We have a very simple eye controller. That's how we animated them, as well as a little blink. We did the same thing on the first short. We sort of translate it down and scale it. So just be careful with that, but that's how you could do a blink. Besides that, it's very similar. There's not many features that are different. That would be the FK has the same features, IK. There's of course no bendy joints because it is a rigid metallic object. I did want to point out that if you go down to the bottom and you try to turn on some of this, detachable parts was part of our experimentation initially to see how we could break off pieces of the rig. So do feel free to play with that if you want, but keep in mind that the behavior down on the lower leg and lower limbs might not be exactly what you're looking for. You could attempt to correct this all with space switching. So if you know the name that this is our, let's say, lower part, you could pick this guy. You'll notice if I move him, it won't move the whole foot. But I could technically just pick him, our lower foot. And once he's in that guy's space, this will allow you to move him as well. So you have the flexibility to set this up any way you want. If you go into asset props, you'll see all the props that we use in the short and we included in the project. Some of them are very simple or just only skeletal meshes. Some of them have little rigs with offsets. They're pretty straightforward. The only thing I want to point out is that these are simple and don't have space switching built in. We used a lot of the Unreal UI for that. As well as if you want to edit the scale, you can't use the controllers. This is applicable to pretty much any rig in Unreal Engine. While they're in your sequencer, you're going to want to go and use the transform that is outside of the control rig to scale the size up and down. You can do that by simply clicking this. This will automatically use the transform, and then you can make your rig bigger. If you try to go, for example, by using the world here, you'll notice you might sometimes get some weird behavior that's not what you'd expect. And finally, let's talk about the camera rig. One thing to note is that our camera rig does not come with a camera. You're going to have to create your own cinematic camera for that. We wanted to keep those separate, and we simply attach the camera to the bottom node. We got a lot of our motion out of these controls, but at the end for our polish pass, we wanted to add a bit of a handheld feel to some shots. So we added this to an animation layer, and we added that animation onto it as well. The basic process, though, if you want to set up your own camera using this rig, which is not necessary, is create a level sequence and then create a camera, a cinematic camera. This should all end up at 0, 0. Then drag your rig in. You'll find that here. Once it's in, you can simply decide to constrain the camera using Unreal's constraints. In parent, you might want to make sure that offset is off, and then constrain, and then you want to constrain it to the handheld node, which is this little pink guy on top. Now you'll be able to just use the rig any way you want and pose your shots. Alternately, if you don't want to use constraints for some reason, it is okay to use an attach node simply for the camera. So once again, you want to pick your cinematic camera, go to plus here and do attach, new binding, and it'll find the camera rig because it's spawned in your level. Once you click on it, it'll give you the hierarchy, so make sure you attach it to the bottom node. Let's take a look at how we did our lighting. The first thing you're going to want to do is open up the master level. Once you're in here, you're going to notice that we have a base lighting setup for the entire show. It might not be reflective of what you're noticing in the render, so the first thing you might want to do is go to Window and Levels, and here you'll see we have a lighting group. By default, layout lights might be on. This is a lighting setup that we used so animators could have clear lighting at all angles when they're doing their play blasts. They had the option to always switch to real lighting to get a sense of the final product, but we did find it easier to work with our own lighting setup while we were in animation. You can always turn this off, and then you'll notice that beta room, gym lights, and corridor lights, they're set up by section. So when you turn all these back on, you'll start to get lighting that is more reminiscent of what you're noticing in the render. You can also then move into the outliner, and here you'll notice there's going to be a lighting setup. If I scroll up here, you'll see there's a light rendering, and here you'll see the groups of all the lights and how we set them up. You'll even see how we set up some volumetric stuff to get a little bit more atmosphere and some God rays coming down from the ceiling. The next thing you might notice is that the shot setup is empty. That's because we spawned those lights specifically to get the right highlights and tweaks per shot. Those are going to be spawned in once you open up the main edit. Once the main edit is open, you'll notice we can dive into any shot, and we'll see a lighting sequence here. Here you'll see all the animation or placement of the lights, and you'll also notice that those lights for that specific shot have been spawned in the shot sequence itself. So here we're in shot 55, and you'll notice that now all the lights that we're working with are spawned. The last thing to talk about is the BP Light Manager. This is a simple blueprint we have so we can manage all the emissives in the scene. This is when you want to switch from the dramatic red lighting during the attack to the blue lighting. You simply select it and head down here to Settings and State, and you can switch between red or blue, or even off if you need to. The visual effects on beta were achieved with a couple of different techniques. The first were our 2D screen space VFX. These were drawn by a 2D artist. We ran them through Nuke to get the chromatic aberration and the glow that we wanted, and then we placed them in front of the camera with an image plane that had an unlit material. We used this technique to achieve most of the hero lasers and sparks, as well as the electrical arcs that we wanted throughout the short. You'll find those plugged in the main edit sequence. We also had some in-engine visual effects. We used Niagara systems for Omega's thrusters, smoke, some extra sparks, and atmosphere and dust that we wanted in the shots. And we also created some secondary sparks and lasers with 2D cards that we could animate through the scene. Let's take a quick look at a few of the assets to see what's included in the package. Omega's thrusters can be brought into the shot using this Niagara system that you find here. Drag them into your sequence and attach them to the dedicated bones at the bottom of each of Omega's thrusters. You can start by setting one up first. Make sure you add the Niagara component, so this exposes all the attributes that are available in that system. And then you want to make sure you put the life cycle track. This will make sure that they're active. You can also decide to split this and turn it off if you ever need to in a shot. Then simply attach it to one of the dedicated bones at the bottom of his thruster, and he's ready to go. In case you want to make them a little bigger, another option that you can explore is the life of the particles themselves. The higher the value, the longer they'll look. Let's look at how we set up our CG lasers in the short. Keep in mind that this is a BP, a blueprint, and not the Niagara system, so make sure you bring in the _BP into your level sequence. We start by using the top node to place it. Normally we would place this at the end of a gun on the muzzle. And we'd expose a couple of attributes. First thing you want to do is add the Ennis laser. Under this one, you'll find a transform that you can animate in X. This will allow it to move away from that first pivot. This way you can adjust it later if you want to change the angle, and you can keyframe it frame by frame across your shot. You'll also want to expose the life as well, just in case you want to turn that on and off. And lastly, you want to look at the sprite index. This will go through all the frames from 0 to 5 that are available in the animated sequence, so you can pick and choose which frames you're playing. We tend to just go 0 to 5 and then loop it. We've also included smoke. You can pay attention to how it's growing by looking at the little widget here when G is turned on. If you want, you can always open up the material and change the opacity in case you find it's not showing up enough. We also included some sparks and other setups for you to play around with. And that's the end of our walkthrough. I really hope you guys enjoyed diving in there, and thanks for watching.